She was running in heels through a Chicago alley at 2 in the morning, her dress torn at the shoulder, her phone dead, and 4 armed men closing the distance behind her. 48 hours earlier, Olivia Sterling had been the most powerful 30-year-old in the city, cover of Chicago Business Monthly, keynote speaker at the Midwest Economic Forum, CEO of a company worth $3 billion. Now she was screaming at a stranger covered in engine grease, begging him to save her life. And the men hunting her, men with guns and earpieces and zero hesitation, stopped dead the moment they saw his face. Not because of who she was, because of who he was. If you've never been on this channel before, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because we tell stories here that you will not find anywhere else. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from tonight. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This one goes all the way to the end. The garage had no sign out front worth reading anymore. Whatever letters had once spelled out Mercer & Sons Towing and Repair had been fading for 3 years, bleached by Chicago summers and scoured by winters until only a ghost of the name remained on the wooden board above the bay doors. The building itself sat on the industrial edge of Pilsen, wedged between a shuttered printing warehouse and a Vietnamese restaurant that only opened on weekends. It wasn't the kind of place anyone looked for. That was more or less the point. Ethan Mercer was lying on his back underneath a 2009 Ford F-250 at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, doing what he usually did when he couldn't sleep, which was most nights, which was work. The truck belonged to a landscaping company out of Bridgeport. Rear differential seal leaking for 6 weeks before the owner finally admitted the smell wasn't going away on its own. The job paid $380. Ethan had promised it by Wednesday morning. He had grease under his fingernails, a smear of it along his left forearm, and a small cut on his right palm from where a socket wrench had slipped 2 hours ago. His back ached in the specific way that came from years of sleeping on surfaces that weren't beds, a habit from a life he no longer talked about. A half-empty bottle of water sat beside the rolling creeper. He hadn't eaten since noon. The radio on the workbench was playing something low, a late-night talk program, the kind where callers phoned in about things that hadn't been resolved and probably never would be. Ethan wasn't really listening. He was thinking about his daughter. Cora was 14. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she was currently upstairs in the apartment above the shop, asleep, with a science project due Thursday that she swore she'd already finished but hadn't. He knew because he'd seen the blank poster board leaning against her desk that morning. He decided not to say anything yet. Let her figure out how close Thursday actually was. She was good, Cora. Better than she had any right to be, given everything. Given the fact that her mother had died when she was 6, a brain aneurysm that came without warning and left Ethan holding a child in a grief so enormous he still hadn't found all its edges. Given the fact that for the first year after, he'd barely functioned. Given the fact that she'd watched her father shrink himself down from whatever he used to be into a man who fixed trucks and answered the phone at 3 in the morning when somebody needed a tow. She didn't complain. She did her homework, mostly. She made him coffee without being asked, strong and terrible, and left it on the workbench like a peace offering. She was going to be fine. He told himself that regularly enough that some nights he almost believed it. He was reaching for a torque wrench when he heard it. Not the radio. Not the street. Something else. A sound that registered in the part of his brain that never fully turned off. The part that had been trained over years in environments where the wrong sound meant someone died. It was the sound of someone running. Not jogging, not hurrying, running. The full-body committed sprint of someone who had no other option left. And then a second sound, the heavier, more measured footsteps of people chasing. Ethan rolled out from under the truck before he'd consciously decided to move. He stood up, wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his belt loop, and walked to the side door of the garage, the one that opened onto the narrow access alley that ran between his building and the print warehouse next door. He opened it just as she hit the wall. She was not what he expected. Not that he'd expected anything in particular, but if he'd had to guess, some drunk stumbling away from a bar, someone having a domestic nightmare in the alley, he would not have guessed this. She was young, late 20s maybe, or just past 30, and dressed like she'd been at something expensive earlier in the evening. Dark dress, one heel gone, hair completely demolished from whatever it had been at the start of the night. There was a scrape along her collarbone, red and raw, like she'd hit pavement, and her eyes were... He noticed the eyes first, not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because they were doing exactly what the eyes of someone in real danger did, scanning everything simultaneously, calculating, trying to figure out which direction meant survival. She saw him standing in the doorway. For half a second, she froze. He watched her make the calculation: stranger, man, dark alley, and he saw her decide that whatever was behind her was worse than whatever he might be. She grabbed his arm with both hands. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Please," she said. Her voice was controlled, but barely. There are men. They have..." "How many?" he said. She blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected him to say. "4," she said. "Maybe I saw 4. I think they have guns." "Come inside." He stepped back. She came through the door. He closed it, turned the deadbolt, and moved to the small dirty window beside it, the one that looked out onto the alley at an angle. He didn't turn on any lights. He counted to 3 before he saw them. 4 men, moving in pairs, the way people moved when they'd done it before. Dark clothing, not uniforms, but coordinated. One of them had a hand near his jacket. They slowed as they reached the door, scanning the alley. Then one of them held up a fist, "Stop," and pointed at a camera mounted above the loading bay of the print warehouse. They were checking sight lines, checking whether there were eyes on them. Ethan stepped back from the window. The woman was behind him, breathing quietly. She was doing a decent job of keeping it together. He gave her credit for that. "Back of the shop," he said, keeping his voice low. "Behind the blue pickup. Stay down." "Who are you?" "The guy with 4 walls and a locked door. Go." She went. He waited by the window another 30 seconds. The men in the alley were conferring, 3 of them facing one who seemed to be running the conversation. Decision point. They'd either try the door or move on. He watched the man in charge look directly at the side entrance, hold there for a moment, and then gesture the group forward, down the alley, away. They moved off. Ethan exhaled slowly. Not relief exactly. More like a brief pause in the situation. He walked to the back of the shop, around the blue Silverado waiting on a brake job, and found her crouched behind the rear tire, arms wrapped around herself. She looked up when she heard him coming. "They're moving on," he said. "For now." Her voice was flat, not panicked. She was thinking. "You want to tell me what that was?" She looked at him for a moment like she was deciding how much truth was safe. He recognized that look too. He'd worn it himself, in rooms where too much information was a liability. "My name is Olivia Sterling," she said. He didn't say anything. "Sterling Global," she said. I know what Sterling Global is." It was hard not to. The company's name was on 2 buildings downtown and a sponsorship banner at the United Center. "You're the CEO." "I was." She stood up, moving carefully on her one remaining heel before she reached down, pulled it off, and threw it at the ground with a precision that suggested she'd been wanting to do that for a while. "Or I still am. The situation is complicated. Most situations that end with 4 guys chasing a woman through an alley at midnight tend to be." She looked at him. Up close, now that the adrenaline was settling, he could see she was exhausted in the deep way, not just tired from tonight, but tired from days, maybe longer. The kind of tired that lived behind the eyes. "I discovered something," she said. "Inside my own company. Financial records, fraudulent contracts, payments that shouldn't exist. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And I can't..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Someone on my board found out that I found out. And now they're trying to make me disappear before I can do anything about it." Ethan said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her shoulder, the left one, where the strap of her dress had been pulled or grabbed. And then he was looking at something else, something she hadn't noticed yet. "Hold still," he said. She tensed immediately. "What?" "I said hold still." He moved around her, looking at the back of her dress just below the shoulder blade, where a small seam ran along the zipper. He leaned in closer. There, flattened against the fabric, nearly invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. A small device the size of a watch battery, with a slight magnetic pull when he pressed his thumbnail against it. He peeled it free. "What is that?" she said, turning. He held it up between 2 fingers. "Tracking device. Whoever dressed you, or whoever was near you tonight before you ran, planted it." She stared at it. He watched something shift in her face, not fear, but a recalculation. The security detail, at the hotel, when they escorted me to the elevator. Her jaw tightened. Those weren't my people. No, Ethan said. They weren't. He walked to the workbench, set the tracker down, picked up a ball-peen hammer, and hit it once. Not dramatically, just enough. Now they think you stopped somewhere between the hotel and here, he said. Buys us maybe 20 minutes before they double back or send someone else. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You know what those are? Tracking devices. I've seen them. That's not a normal thing to know. No, he agreed. It's not. Who are you? She said. Not the social question, the real one. He picked up his water bottle, took a drink, set it down. Ethan Mercer. I run a tow and repair shop. I have a daughter upstairs who's got a science project due Thursday. She hasn't started yet. He paused. That's what I am now. Now. She caught the word. She was sharp. Even scared and exhausted, she was sharp. Now, he confirmed, and he didn't explain further. She looked around the shop, at the trucks in various states of repair, at the tools hanging on pegboards, at the ancient coffee maker on the corner shelf, at the child's drawing taped beside the light switch, a crayon house with a sun above it, his name in Cora's 8-year-old handwriting along the bottom, Daddy's shop. Something in her expression changed. Not softened, exactly, more like recalibrated. They'll know they lost the signal, she said. They already know. They'll search this block. Probably. So we can't stay here. Not much longer, he said. She pushed a piece of hair off her face. Her hands were steadier than they'd been 2 minutes ago. I have a lawyer. Her name is Dana Reyes. She's the only person I trust right now. She has copies of some of the documents. Not everything, but enough to... We can talk about that. He held up a hand, listening. Outside, a car passed slowly. The engine's sound was particular, not the idle cruise of someone lost, but the deliberate reduced speed of someone looking. He moved back to the window. 2 men on the near sidewalk, on foot, moving methodically, checking doorways. They were doubling back faster than he'd estimated. He turned around. There's a back exit, he said. Through the parts room, out through the fire door, puts you in the courtyard behind the Vietnamese restaurant. Can you run? She held up her bare feet. The pavement had done some work on them. She didn't say it like a complaint. She said it like a fact she needed him to have. He went to the corner where a milk crate held miscellaneous lost property, items left in vehicles by customers who'd never come back for them. He found a pair of slip-on canvas shoes, women's, from what someone had forgotten in the back seat of a sedan 8 months ago. They were too large, but only by a size. He held them out. She looked at them. Not at him, at the shoes themselves, worn at the heels. Someone else's. She took them, put them on without comment. My daughter's upstairs, he said. I need to... Go, she said immediately. Go, I'll wait. He went up the back stairs 2 at a time, eased open the apartment door, moved through the dark hallway to Cora's room. She was on her side, arm thrown over the edge of the bed, the specific boneless sleep of teenagers, breathing steady. He stood there for 4 seconds, he counted, and then he quietly shut her door, went back to his own room, pulled a phone from the nightstand. Not his regular one. A prepaid, still in its wrapping. He tore it open, powered it on, came back downstairs. Olivia was exactly where he'd left her, back against the Silverado, watching the front of the shop from that angle. Does your lawyer have a number that isn't in your contacts? He asked. I have it memorized. Good. She'd been preparing for this, at least in some version of her mind. People who memorized numbers were people who'd thought about what happened when phones were compromised. He handed her the prepaid. She dialed. Waited. 4 rings before someone answered, and even from where he stood, Ethan could hear the voice on the other end. A woman, awake, already alert, like she'd been waiting for exactly this call. Dana, Olivia said quietly, I'm alive. I need you to listen, like watching a person remember what they were made of. Dana's going to reach out to a federal contact, she said. She can't go to the local police. 2 detectives on the payroll, she's almost certain. We need 48 hours. What happens in 48 hours? Emergency board meeting. Hawthorne is calling it to push through a vote that strips my authority. If he gets that vote before we can present the evidence... She stopped. It won't matter that I'm right. It'll be legal, and I'll have nothing. Ethan studied her face. And the evidence you need? It's in the company's distribution center on the southwest side. Audit files, payment records. Hawthorne's people didn't know I'd already moved copies to a secondary server before I was locked out. But I need to get to them physically. The server isn't connected externally. You need to break into your own building. The building I own, she said, with a precise emphasis that was almost dry, almost composed. Technically. He almost smiled. He didn't, but almost. He jerked his head toward the parts room. Come on, we go out the back. She followed him without hesitation, stepping carefully over the old rotors in the dark, not complaining, not asking how far or what next. Just moving. He held the fire door, and she ducked through it into the night air, and he came through after her, pulling it shut behind them. Above them, through the apartment window, a light clicked on. He looked up. Cora's room. Her lamp. The one shaped like a moon that she'd had since she was 4 and claimed she was too old for but had never taken down. He stood there for a second longer than he should have. You have to go back to her, Olivia said quietly. She was watching his face. She'll be asleep again in 3 minutes. She does this, wakes up, turns on the light, goes back out. He said it evenly. She's fine. He said it evenly. But he stood there for one more second anyway before he turned toward the chain-link fence and looked for the break in the corner where it had been pulled back years ago and never properly repaired. He found it. Pulled the fence back, gestured her through. She went. He followed, and they moved together into the dark streets of Pilsen, the city indifferent around them, the night still warm and full of things that hadn't decided yet what they were going to become. The chain-link fence scraped the back of Olivia's hand as she came through, and she didn't make a sound. Ethan noticed. He noticed most things, and the ones he noticed about her in the first 20 minutes after leaving the shop were adding up to a picture that didn't match what he'd assumed. He'd assumed she was what the news made her out to be, polished, insulated, the kind of person whose problems were usually solved by a phone call to someone else. The kind of CEO who had never in her adult life been in a situation where the right shoes mattered. But she was keeping pace without complaint. She was thinking instead of panicking. And she hadn't asked him a single question he didn't need to answer. That meant she understood operational discipline even if she'd never been trained in it. Or it meant she was scared enough to be smart. Either way, it worked. They moved north through the back corridor of streets, staying off the main drag, cutting through the parking lot of a closed laundromat, and then east past a block of 2 flats where most of the windows were dark. The canvas shoes were clearly too big. He could hear them slapping slightly with each step. But she'd adjusted her stride and wasn't rolling her ankle, which meant she was paying attention to her own body in real time. Good. He kept his phone in his left hand, the prepaid he'd given her in her right, and they moved fast enough to cover ground without moving fast enough to draw notice from the occasional car. She broke the silence first. Where are we going? Wicker Park. I know someone with a place that's been empty for 3 months. Landlord's waiting on permits for a renovation. No active tenants. No reason for anyone to be watching it. How do you know it's empty? Because I towed the last tenant's car to O'Hare in July when she moved to Portland, and her landlord hasn't fixed the front step yet. I drive past it twice a week. Olivia was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific kind of knowledge. Small business, he said. You learn the neighborhood. It wasn't entirely false. It was also not entirely the whole truth, which was that years of operating in environments where you had to know the terrain before you needed it had left him permanently in the habit of cataloging exits, vacancies, sight lines, and the rhythms of whatever block he found himself on. He didn't do it consciously anymore. It was like breathing. They walked another 2 blocks before she said, The men who were following me, when they saw you in the alley, they stopped. He said nothing. I was watching their faces, she said. The one in front, the one running the group. His expression changed. Not surprise. Something else. She paused. Fear. You were scared. You were probably reading, I know what I saw. Her voice wasn't defensive, just clear. I spend my career in rooms full of people who don't want to show what they're actually feeling. I'm very good at reading faces. That man was afraid of you. Ethan kept walking. The city moved around them, indifferent and enormous. Then maybe they thought I was someone else, he said. She let it go. But she didn't forget it. He could tell by the way she filed it away, visibly, the way someone stores a fact they intend to return to. The building in Wicker Park was a narrow three-flat on a residential street lined with old maples, their roots cracking the sidewalk in the specific Chicago way that the city fixed, and the roots cracked again, cycle without end. The front step was indeed missing a board, replaced with a temporary piece of plywood that had been there long enough to warp. The first floor unit was dark. All three units were dark. Ethan went around to the gangway on the north side, found the basement window he'd known was there. He'd helped the old super replace the latch 2 years ago, and the replacement latch was the same cheap hardware that only locked if you pushed it hard to the left, which most people didn't, and they were inside in under a minute. The basement smelled like old wood and dust and faintly of the boiler that ran along the east wall. There were folding chairs stacked in the corner, a card table, a shelf of dead paint cans. Not comfortable, but functional. Nobody lived here. Nobody was watching. Olivia sat down on one of the folding chairs. He dragged another one over, turned it backward, sat with his arms folded on the back of it, and looked at her directly for the first time since the shop. "Tell me everything," he said. "Not the version you'd give to a reporter. The real version, with the parts that make you look bad too." She met his gaze. "That's a strange thing to ask. If I'm going to help you, I need to know what I'm actually dealing with, not the cleaned-up story." Something moved in her face. A resistance, and then the slow release of it. She was used to controlling narrative. Being asked to give up that control, especially to a man she'd met 40 minutes ago in a dark alley, ran against every instinct she'd built a career on. But she started talking. Sterling Global had been her father's company first. Marcus Sterling, who'd built a mid-sized logistics and distribution firm over 30 years through a combination of actual competence and the particular stubbornness of a man who had something to prove. He'd died 4 years ago. Heart. Sudden, the way those things were, with no warning and no time to say the things that probably needed saying. He'd left Olivia the company, the title, and a board of directors that had tolerated her in a way that was indistinguishable from waiting for her to fail. She'd spent 2 years proving herself, growing the company's revenue by 30%, expanding into 3 new regional markets, making acquisitions that the board had initially opposed, and then quietly took credit for when the numbers came in. She'd become good at the work. She'd also become good at ignoring things she didn't want to look at directly, which was the part that lived in the spaces she didn't talk about. "The security contracts," she said, her voice leveling out as she found the facts underneath the story. "We have a corporate security division, building services, executive protection, data infrastructure. It was expanded 3 years ago under a board-approved budget initiative. Richard Hawthorne sat on the oversight committee. The contracts went to 3 firms. She paused. "I found out 6 weeks ago that 2 of those firms don't exist. They're shells. The payments, $640 million over 28 months, went into accounts that untangle into a network I couldn't map all the way, but what I could see was enough. It's a systematic extraction. It's been running since before my father died." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "6 weeks ago?" "Yes." "What did you do about it 6 weeks ago?" She looked at the floor. "I verified what I could verify. I brought in Dana, my attorney. We started building a file. I didn't go to the board because—" She stopped. "Because Hawthorne is on the board," Ethan said. "Because I didn't know how far it went," she said. "I still don't, fully. Hawthorne, definitely. 2 other board members, probably. How deep into operations?" She shook her head. "I was trying to build a complete picture before I moved. If I moved too early and they got ahead of it, they got ahead of it anyway." "Yes." The word was flat and final. "Someone inside my own executive team told them I was building a case. My deputy CFO, I think. Or someone in his office." She looked up. "I should have moved faster. I knew that, and I didn't. And now 6 weeks of work might be, where are the files?" She walked him through it. The distribution center on Ashland, southwest side, an industrial property the company used for regional logistics operations. There was a secondary server room on the 3rd floor, installed 2 years ago for overflow data storage. Most of the executive team didn't know it existed. It had been set up during a building renovation, listed under an infrastructure code that nobody had ever looked at twice. Olivia had moved copies of the most critical audit files there herself, physically, during a routine facilities inspection 2 months ago. She'd had the instinct that something was wrong even then, before she'd found the contracts, just the low background frequency of something not adding up. and she'd acted on it without being able to articulate why. The server is air-gapped, she said, not connected to the external network. You have to be in the room to access it, and access requires a biometric scan I set up under a maintenance credential that isn't associated with my name. Who else knows it's there? Nobody. I set it up alone. The building crew who installed the infrastructure 2 years ago, they just installed a server rack. They didn't know what was on it. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "What's on it exactly?" "Copies of the original contracts, the payment records, the shell company registrations, and..." She paused. "Internal communications. Emails. Between Hawthorne and at least 2 of the 3 firm operators. Discussing the extraction. Discussing what happens if I find out." Her jaw tightened. "Discussing my father." He looked at her. "Your father." He was going to find out. He'd started asking questions about the security budget in the last year of his life. Someone on that board knew. The emails... Her voice stayed controlled, but just barely. "There's an email from Hawthorne that says the timeline needed to accelerate because Marcus was becoming a problem." The room was quiet. Ethan had been in this kind of quiet before. The specific silence that follows information that rewrites what you thought you understood. "He died 3 months after that email," Olivia said. "Heart attack? Sudden. No history of cardiac issues." She looked directly at him. "I don't know what that means. I might never know. But I know what the email says." He didn't tell her what to do with that. Some things you don't try to problem solve. He just let it sit. After a moment he said, "The board meeting. When?" Hawthorne called an emergency session. 48 hours from now, 10 in the morning. He's framed it as a governance crisis. CEO missing, company under threat of regulatory scrutiny. If the vote passes, my signing authority is suspended. An interim CEO is appointed, his candidate, obviously, and any investigation I've initiated becomes subject to board approval to continue. She paused. "Which means it ends." "We have 48 hours to get into that building and pull the files. And get them in front of the right people. Federal investigators, not local. Dana has a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She's been cultivating that relationship for exactly this scenario. If we can get the files to him directly, with proper chain of custody, he can move before the vote, or at minimum create enough noise to delay it." Ethan stood up. He walked to the small basement window, looked at the street-level view outside. Concrete grass, the bottom of a mailbox. Nothing moving. His mind was working on several things simultaneously, the way it used to. Building layouts, personnel patterns. The difference between what Olivia thought the problem was and what the problem actually was. She thought the problem was getting the files. That was part of it. The real problem was that whoever was running this operation had already demonstrated they were willing to use armed men and tracking devices on a sitting CEO. That wasn't improvised. That was infrastructure, which meant they'd had this contingency planned, which meant they'd had people and resources positioned before tonight, which meant the men in the alley, he said without turning around. What exactly did they look like? Dark clothing, earpieces. They had the bearing of, they moved like military people, or people trained to look like it. Patches? Logos? Anything on the jackets? The hotel's security logo, but the real hotel security, I know those men. I've walked past them 100 times. These weren't them. How many different faces did you see from the moment you left your hotel room to the moment you got to my alley? She thought about it. 6, maybe 7. At least 4 active, the others I clocked in the lobby and the parking structure. Any of them look familiar? Not from the hotel, from anywhere else. She started to say no, and then she stopped. One of them, in the parking structure. I thought... She frowned. He was at a conference 2 months ago, corporate security conference. I was a keynote speaker. I assumed he was there as a vendor rep. Ethan turned around. He was scoping you. 2 months ago. This has been planned for at least 2 months. She absorbed that. Not breaking down, not catastrophizing, just absorbing it and adjusting. Then Hawthorne knew I was building a case, she said, before I even fully knew I was building one. Or he's been planning this exit strategy for longer than that, and your investigation just accelerated the timeline. He picked up the prepaid phone. You said Dana has a federal contact. Does she have it in writing, a secure line? She has a relationship. They've communicated before through a secure channel she set up for exactly this kind of... She's a good lawyer. She thinks 3 moves ahead. Call her again. Tell her we're going to need the federal contact activated in the next 12 hours. She shouldn't wait for the files. She should start the conversation now. Get him positioned. The files will be the confirmation, not the introduction. Olivia took the phone. Before she dialed, she looked at him. You said we. I did. Why? He thought about several answers. Some of them were true, and some of them were partially true, and none of them were simple. He settled on the most honest one, which was also the least complete. Because I know this network, he said, not this specific operation, but the structure, the people who build these things. 8 years ago, I was part of a federal operation that came very close to dismantling an organization that used military-trained contractors and shell company financing to run extraction schemes inside major corporations. He paused. We didn't finish the job. The operation was shut down. I was told budget constraints, interagency conflict. I always thought there was more to it. He looked at her. What you're describing, the structure of the shell companies, the way the contractors move, it's the same architecture. She was very still. The same organization. I don't know that yet, but similar enough that I need to know. She held his gaze for a long moment. You walked away from that life. You have a daughter upstairs, back at the shop, I mean. You have... She gestured at nothing, meaning everything. A life. Yeah. And you're going to help me anyway. He didn't make it dramatic. You needed help. It ended up being the kind of help I can give. He nodded at the phone in her hand. Make the call. She made the call. He listened to her side of the conversation. Dana Reyes picked up on the second ring, and from the quality of the silence before she spoke, she'd been awake since before Olivia's first call, sitting somewhere with a notepad and probably already several pages into it. Olivia was efficient, precise, gave Dana exactly the information she needed in the order she needed it. She was good at this, Ethan noticed again. The corporate machinery fell away when she was operating in crisis, and what was underneath was someone who could think clearly under pressure. He stepped away to give her some privacy, moving toward the back of the basement, and took out his own phone. He had 3 contacts he still used from the old days, people who had stayed in the work, or adjacent to it, who still picked up when he called even after years of silence. He opened the messages thread with the one he trusted most, a man named Vic Salloway, who'd spent 12 years in federal investigations before going private, and who currently worked as an independent forensic analyst out of D.C., but kept his ear to anything that moved through Chicago. He typed, You hear anything moving through Chicago corporate security circles last few months? Contractors, shell company activity. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to Olivia. She'd finished with Dana. Her face was focused, the pieces visibly clicking into position. Dana's making contact tonight, she said. Her federal contact, his name is Gaines, she didn't give me more than that, has already been aware of some irregular activity in the Sterling Global financial filings. She said he's been waiting for an inside source. Then we're giving him one, Ethan said. We still need the physical files, digital copies through secure channels, but the original stored files. Gaines will need chain of custody documentation, the server at the distribution center. I know. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking at the paint cans on the shelf, not really seeing them. The distribution center on Ashland. He needed to know that building. Layout, personnel schedule, access points. He had maybe 12 hours before daylight made the city harder, and maybe 36 before whoever was running the contractors decided the chessboard needed new moves. He looked at Olivia. You need to sleep. She laughed, not bitterly, but the laugh of someone whose body had just confirmed the suggestion before her mind could protest. I don't think I can. You've been running on adrenaline for how long? Since this afternoon. I found the device on my desk. Someone had accessed my private office terminal and they didn't clean it perfectly. I saw what they'd pulled and She stopped. I grabbed what I could carry and I left through the service exit. That was around 4. 7 hours. 7 hours of sustained terror, operational thinking, physical running, and holding herself together. Even the best conditioned people started losing cognitive precision around hour 8. There are some drop cloths in the corner, he said. It's not... I've had worse. She said it without context, and something in the way she said it made him not ask. She arranged 2 of the drop cloths on the floor near the boiler where the ambient heat would reach. and lay down with her arm folded under her head. She looked deeply impractical in the remains of what had once been an expensive dress, the oversized canvas shoes still on her feet, her hair in a state of complete surrender. Ethan sat against the wall, back straight, and settled into the particular kind of half-sleep that wasn't really sleep, the kind where the body rests and the mind keeps circling. He'd done it on enough concrete floors in enough parts of the world that his body had learned to take what it could get without needing anything to be different. His phone buzzed 30 minutes later. Vic Salloway. Yeah, something moving. Hawthorne Group affiliates, heard it peripheral. Why you asking after 8 years? He typed back. Because I'm in it. 3 dots. Then, of course you are. Call me at 6. He set the phone face down on his knee and looked at the ceiling. He thought about Cora, asleep above the shop 2 miles away, the moon lamp casting its small light. He'd left her a note on the kitchen table. Had to go out, call if you need me, back by morning, which she would see if she woke early, which she sometimes did on days she was anxious about school things. It was inadequate. It was the best he had. He thought about the operation 8 years ago. The name they'd given it internally, Glass Tower. The moment it had collapsed, not from enemy action, but from a phone call he'd received at 6 in the morning from a deputy director he'd never met, telling him the operation was suspended pending review and that he should stand down all assets. He'd stood down. He'd gone home. A different city, a different version of his life. And 6 weeks later, his wife had died. And then none of the questions about Glass Tower had seemed to matter. They were mattering now. He closed his eyes, not sleeping, waiting for 6 o'clock when he would call Vic Salloway and the shape of what he was actually walking into would come a little clearer. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, breathing, indifferent to the particular lives unfolding inside any one building on any one block. Somewhere on the other side of the maze of it, a man named Richard Hawthorne was probably sleeping well, confident in his positioning, confident in his people, confident in the machine he'd spent years building inside the infrastructure of someone else's company. He had 36 hours before the board vote. He had a woman on his floor who knew where the evidence was. He had a name from the past, Glass Tower, that was waking up in the back of his mind like something that had been waiting for exactly this. And he had a daughter who needed him to come back in the morning and pretend, at least for a while, that everything was normal. He was going to do all of it. He didn't know yet how, but that had never been the first problem. The first problem was always simpler. You stayed in it, and you thought, and you found the next move. He found it. At 5:50 in the morning, while Olivia was still asleep and the light through the basement window had just started shifting from black to the particular gray-blue of a Chicago dawn, Ethan stood up, stretched the tightness out of his lower back, and began planning how to walk 2 people into a secured corporate distribution center in broad daylight without anyone stopping them. By the time 6 o'clock came, he had the outline. When Vic Salloway answered on the first ring, voice alert like he'd been awake for hours, Ethan started talking. Vic Salloway talked for 19 minutes without stopping, which was unusual for him. Ethan had known the man for 11 years, and in that time had learned that Vic measured words the way a careful person measured medication, precisely, with full awareness that too much of the wrong thing caused damage. When Vic talked for 19 minutes straight, it meant the information was heavy enough that he didn't trust himself to stop and start. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. He stood near the basement window, watching the gray light thicken into morning, and let Vic's voice build the picture. The organization didn't have a clean name. Federal analysts had referred to it under 3 different designations across 12 years of fragmented investigation, none of which had ever produced an indictment. Vic called it the bracket, which was his own term, derived from the way its financial structure nested, shell inside shell inside shell, each layer technically separate, each layer providing the ones inside it legal insulation. The architecture was elegant in the way that genuinely dangerous things tended to be elegant, simple at its core, complex only at its edges, designed so that dismantling any one layer revealed nothing essential about the one beneath. What Ethan had encountered 8 years ago in the operation they'd called Glass Tower was one specific activation of the bracket, a contractor network embedded in 3 Midwest defense suppliers. They'd gotten close. Close enough that the people running it had apparently noticed, and close enough that someone with access to interagency communications had pulled the operation before the final phase. Vic had always believed the shutdown was not accidental. Ethan had believed the same thing for about 6 weeks after it happened, and then stopped letting himself think about it because his wife had died and the grief had taken everything else with it. Hawthorne has been a Bracket affiliate for at least 6 years, Vic said. Not a founder, not leadership, an access point. He provides entry into corporate structures, board positions, contract oversight, fiduciary authority. And the Bracket uses those positions to run extraction. They've done it in at least 4 companies we know about. Sterling Global is the largest. What happened to the other 4? A pause. 2 resolved quietly. The companies took losses they attributed to market conditions, and nobody looked too hard. 1 went bankrupt. 1, another pause, shorter. 1 had a CEO who got too close to the truth. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What happened to him? Cardiac event, 51 years old, no prior history. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. Marcus Sterling, Ethan said. I can't confirm that, but the timeline fits and the circumstances fit, and I'll tell you what I tell everyone in this situation. I can't confirm it, but I'm not telling you you're wrong. Ethan looked at Olivia across the basement. She was awake, sitting up, listening to his half of the conversation with the particular focused stillness of someone whose entire nervous system was tuned to receive information. She'd heard enough to understand the shape of it, if not the details. The contractors who were running the pursuit last night, Ethan said. Are they Bracket people? Mixed. The leadership is Bracket connected. The ground-level operators are hired. Private security, ex-military. Some of them knew who you were from the old days. Your glass tower work wasn't exactly off the books from their perspective. Vic paused. When they saw your face, Ethan, they weren't scared of a mechanic. They were scared of the guy who put 3 of their colleagues in federal holding for 8 months before the operation collapsed. That was why they'd stopped. That was why the man in front had held up his fist, held the group, pulled them back. Not random caution, recognition. They'd made him, and making him had changed their math. So they'll recalibrate, Ethan said. They'll upgrade. If they had 4 people last night, they'll have 8 today, and they'll stop being subtle. How long do I have before they find where we are? Depends on how clean your exit was. If the tracker's dead and you didn't use cards or cameras, we're clean. Then 12 hours, maybe more. They'll have to do it the old-fashioned way, which takes time, but Ethan, Vic's voice changed register. These aren't people who stop because it gets complicated. The Bracket doesn't leave loose ends. I know. Do you have the girl somewhere safe? He meant Cora. Of course he did. Vic knew about Cora, had known since the beginning, had sent a card when Lauren died that Ethan still had in a drawer because he'd never been able to make himself throw it away. She's at the shop, Ethan said. She doesn't know anything's happening. She needs to not be at the shop. He already knew that. He'd been sitting with it since 4 in the morning, turning it over, looking for a version of the next 24 hours where Cora was safe and didn't know why she needed to be and wasn't frightened. The closest he'd gotten was his neighbor, Ruth Kasparian, a 68-year-old retired teacher 3 doors down who'd been Cora's emergency contact since Cora was 8 and who made her dinner sometimes when Ethan was running late on a job. Ruth asked no questions. She just opened the door. I'll handle it, he said. Okay. Vic was quiet for a second. The distribution center on Ashland. I pulled the building records this morning. 3rd floor, server room, northwest corner. The access point is a maintenance corridor that runs off the east stairwell. Building has a contract security team, 40-hour rotation, 6 personnel total, 2 on site at any given time during business hours. Night crew is 3, but 2 of them are on the main floor. How do you have the building records? Because I've been looking at Sterling Global since last year when one of their subcontractor filings caught my attention, and I couldn't quite figure out why. A beat. I told you, Ethan, I keep my ear to things. I just didn't know someone was going to walk into the middle of it at midnight. He thanked Vic, got 2 more pieces of information he needed, and hung up. Olivia was standing by the time he turned around. She'd pulled her hair back with a rubber band she'd found somewhere, probably her own wrist, the kind women kept there out of habit, and her face was set with the expression he was starting to recognize as her working face. Composed not because nothing was wrong, but because she'd decided that falling apart was a cost she couldn't afford right now. Your father, he said. She held his gaze. Tell me. He told her what Vic had told him. Not softened, not managed. She'd asked for the real version, and she was going to get it. He watched her face as the information landed, watched her absorb the suggestion about Marcus Sterling's death, watched her decide what to do with it. Her jaw was tight. Her hands, hanging at her sides, were still.
I knew, she said finally, quietly. Not the specifics, but somewhere I knew it wasn't. She stopped. He was healthy. He exercised. He didn't smoke, barely drank. When it happened, something in me said this isn't right, and then I put it away because I didn't know what to do with it, and I had a company to save, and... She exhaled. I put it away. You were 26 and your father had just died. That's not an excuse. It's not an excuse, he agreed. It's just what happened. She looked at him for a moment with something like surprise, not at the words, but at the fact that he wasn't trying to make her feel better. She'd had years of people trying to make her feel better about Marcus, and she had always known, at some level, that their comfort was really about their own discomfort with her grief. Ethan just stated the fact and let her hold it. Okay, she said. And then, because she was exactly the kind of person she was. What's the plan? He told her that too. The distribution center was not a fortress. That was both its advantage and the problem. Because it didn't look like a fortress, people inside it had gotten complacent, which meant the security culture was uneven. Vic's building records showed a standard corporate access system, keycard entry, a front desk with a sign-in log, camera coverage on the ground floor and exterior. The third floor, where the server room was, had been added to the camera system only 6 months ago. Before that, it had been essentially unsupervised. The new cameras covered the main corridor, but not the maintenance access point that ran off the east stairwell. The plan had 4 components, none of which were complicated, all of which depended on Olivia knowing the building the way someone who'd done a facilities inspection would know it. She did. She walked him through it from memory: loading dock on the south side, service elevator that required a separate keycard from the main elevator bank, a fire suppression panel on the second floor that controlled the building's sprinkler zones independently, maintenance tunnels that connected the east and west stairwells through a utility corridor that had been designed for HVAC access and was never used for anything else. How detailed is your memory of the third floor? He asked. Very. I set up the server room myself. I know every room up there. The personnel, regular employees. What's their day like on the third floor? Administrative offices mostly. Scheduling, logistics coordination. People are in and out between 8 and 6. After 6, it's skeleton staff, maybe 3 people total on the whole floor, usually in the west-facing offices. So if we go mid-morning, we look like everyone else. If we look like we belong, she said. And right now I look like... She gestured at herself. The dress was irreparably beyond professional. The canvas shoes were someone's forgotten beach footwear. That's solvable, he said. He called Ruth Kasparian at 6:45. Ruth answered with the cheerful efficiency of someone who'd been awake for 2 hours already and had already had strong opinions about the morning news. I need a favor, he said. A big one. How big? I need you to take Cora for the day. Maybe tonight too. I'll explain when I can. Ruth was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. She'd known Ethan long enough to understand that when he asked without explaining, there was a reason. And the reason was not something she wanted details about. She needs anything? Just tell her I had an emergency job. Long haul. She'll be annoyed, but she won't panic. I'll make the good pasta, Ruth said, which meant she understood the situation was serious and had decided that feeding his daughter well was her contribution to solving it. He loved Ruth Kasparian in the specific way you loved people who showed up without needing the whole story. He sent a text to Cora from his regular phone. Emergency job came in overnight. Big toe up to Milwaukee. Staying with Ruth today. Don't argue. I love you. Science project. The last 2 words were a reminder about Thursday. She would understand both things. She texted back 11 minutes later, which meant she'd been asleep. You owe me. Ruth better have food. And then, after a pause, be careful. She knew him. She'd always known more than he gave her credit for. He put his regular phone away and focused. The clothing problem was solved through Dana Reyes, who turned out to be exactly as capable as Olivia had described. Dana arrived at the building in Wicker Park at 8:15 in a gray sedan,
moving with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided at some point in her career that panic was not a useful professional tool. She was mid-40s, small, with sharp eyes, and the kind of stillness that courtroom lawyers developed when they'd learned to control their reactions in front of hostile witnesses. She looked at Ethan without the wariness he'd expected, which told him Olivia had given her enough context on the phone that she'd made her assessment already. Dana had brought 2 changes of clothing in a bag from a 24-hour drugstore and a spare outfit of her own that she handed to Olivia without comment. She'd also brought coffee in paper cups and a bag of food that suggested she'd thought about the practical reality of what the next several hours required. Ethan noticed all of this. "Gaines is activated," Dana said, sitting on a folding chair with her coffee and a notepad already open. "I spoke to him at 6. He's been monitoring the Sterling global situation at the margins for 8 months. When I told him we had a source with physical access to primary documentation, She paused. "He used the word breakthrough, and he doesn't use words like that." "Does he have authority to move before the board vote?" Olivia asked. "He has authority to issue a temporary injunction against the vote if he presents a formal preliminary finding of ongoing fraud to a federal judge. Getting that injunction requires the documentation." Dana looked at Ethan. "Which you're going to retrieve this morning." "This morning," Ethan confirmed. "What's your cover story for entering the building?" He told her what he'd worked out. Industrial safety inspection, not uncommon, not alarming, and the kind of visit that building management resented but couldn't easily obstruct because the regulatory framework gave inspectors broad access authority. The trick was paperwork. Official-looking, specific, with a company name and a contact number that would reach a voice that confirmed the inspection was legitimate. He looked at Dana. "Can you generate a set of inspection credentials in the next 90 minutes? She looked at him like he'd asked if she could spell her own name. "I'm a corporate attorney with 3 paralegals who have been up since 5. "Yes." "The contact number needs to be live. Someone has to answer." "One of my paralegals is 24 and does community theater. She can answer a phone as an office administrator." Dana wrote something in her notepad. "What firm name?" "Mid-America Industrial Safety Compliance Group," Ethan said, long enough to sound like it's been around since 1987 without anyone thinking too hard about it. Dana wrote it down without blinking. "What else?" "I need the building's floor plan confirmed against what Ms. Sterling has from memory. And I need the name of the current facilities manager, whoever would receive an inspection notice." Dana made 2 more notes. 2 hours, she said. "I'll have it." Olivia was pulling on Dana's spare blouse, a navy button-down, professional, 3 sizes close enough to work, and looked over at Ethan while Dana made phone calls in the corner. "You did this kind of thing before. The cover, the operational planning. Similar things. You were good at it." "Good enough." She considered him. "You don't like talking about it?" "No." "Is that because it was classified or because you don't like who you were when you were doing it?" He looked at her steadily. She was direct in a way that could have been rude but landed instead as honest. She asked because she genuinely wanted to understand, not because she wanted leverage. "Both," he said, "in different amounts depending on the day." She nodded, accepting that, and went back to fixing the collar of the blouse. He noticed she didn't push. Some people, when you gave them a door left slightly open, immediately tried to get all the way through it. She didn't. She took what was offered and left the rest. At 10:20 in the morning, under a sky that had gone overcast and gray in the particular way that made Chicago feel simultaneously enormous and close, Ethan Mercer and Olivia Sterling walked through the front entrance of Sterling Global's Ashland Distribution Center, carrying clipboards, wearing laminated badges, and looking like exactly the sort of people that building managers dreaded seeing on a Tuesday morning. Ethan had changed into a set of dark work pants, and a button-down he kept in a go-bag that Ruth had retrieved from the shop and left on her porch. He looked competent and bureaucratic, which was the precise combination required. Olivia looked corporate and humorless, her hair pinned back, Dana's blouse tucked perfectly into a pair of slacks that were half an inch too long but didn't show enough to matter. The front desk was staffed by a young man with a facilities badge who looked up at them with the preemptive resignation of someone who already knew this visit was going to create paperwork for someone. Ethan spoke first, before the young man could establish the conversational dynamic. "Mid-America Industrial Safety Compliance Group. We have a scheduled notice with your facilities manager, Mr." He checked the clipboard. "Donahue.
Fire suppression system audit, third-party mandated under Illinois SB 440. You should have a notice in your system from last Friday. The young man checked his computer
With the expression of someone who absolutely did not have a notice in the system and was trying to decide how to handle that.
I don't see. The notice would have come through your building management office, not this desk, Olivia said, in the flat, patient tone of someone who had explained this specific bureaucratic distinction 17 times this week and was prepared to explain it a 17th. We can wait while you contact facilities directly, or we can proceed with the inspection under the regulatory timeline, at your facility's preference.
The young man made a phone call. Someone in facilities apparently confirmed that yes, there was something about an inspection, maybe, probably, which was close enough to send them upstairs with visitor badges and a mild expression of institutional defeat. The elevator to the third floor was slow. Neither of them spoke. Ethan clocked the camera positions as they moved through the corridor. Two, covering the main hall, angled toward the elevator bank and the primary office entrance. The maintenance corridor door was 20 feet east of the elevator, marked HVAC's utility access, authorized personnel only, which meant it had a keycard reader. He'd expected that. He walked to it without hesitation, because hesitation was what got people stopped. He held the laminated badge up to the reader. It beeped red. He said, loud enough for the one employee visible at the far end of the corridor to hear. A woman at a standing desk, headphones on, not really paying attention. He hit the badge against the reader 2 more times, with the familiar frustration of someone whose credentials should work and mysteriously didn't. Then he turned and walked back to the main office entrance with the energy of a man who was going to sort this out properly. He found the building's fire suppression panel on the 2nd floor, where Olivia had said it would be. A gray metal cabinet on the wall of the utility closet beside the 2nd floor break room. He opened it. The zone controls were clearly labeled in the way that building systems always were, practical and unglamorous. Zone 4 was the 3rd floor east corridor. He found the test function, which temporarily activated the suppression alert for that zone without triggering actual water discharge. It was a diagnostic function meant for exactly this kind of inspection, which meant using it was not even technically unauthorized. He activated Zone 4. The alert was not loud. A pulsing indicator on the panel, an automated announcement through the building PA system advising personnel in the 3rd floor east corridor that a fire suppression test was in progress and to please clear the area temporarily as a precautionary measure. Standard language. Boring language. The kind of announcement that made people pick up their coffee and drift toward the main corridor without urgency, because everyone knew what suppression tests were and nobody was scared. The woman with the headphones drifted toward the main corridor. The 3rd floor east corridor was empty. Ethan met Olivia at the stairwell door. They went up through the utility corridor. The keycard reader on this side was a maintenance-grade unit, the same brand as the one on the exterior, and Vic had given him a cloned frequency from the building permit records that the contractor who'd installed the system had filed with the city and never updated. Sloppy. The door opened. The maintenance corridor was narrow and smelled like old ductwork. They moved through it in single file, Ethan first, Olivia right behind him. 30 feet, a right turn, and then a door on the left that opened into the server room. She had the biometric credentials set up under a maintenance worker's name, a man who had quit 18 months ago and whose biometric profile still existed in the system because nobody had deactivated it. She pressed her thumb to the reader. The system had been trained to her thumb as a secondary authorized user under that credential. A half-second pause that felt much longer. Then green. The server room was small and cold and humming. Rack after rack of storage equipment, status lights blinking in patient rhythms. Olivia went directly to the unit in the northwest corner without looking at anything else, pulled a small drive from her pocket. Dana had brought it, along with everything else, and had the interface open in under a minute. Ethan stood at the door and listened to the corridor. "How long?" he said quietly. 8 minutes, maybe 10. "You have 7. She worked without responding, pulling the files with the efficiency of someone who had imagined this moment enough times that doing it felt like memory rather than action. He heard the drive writing. He heard the faint sounds of the building settling back into its normal rhythms as the suppression test notification expired and people began drifting back to their desks. 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Done, she said. They retraced the route through the maintenance corridor, down the east stairwell, through the second floor utility closet where Ethan closed the fire suppression panel and reset Zone 4 to active monitoring, and out through the service entrance on the building's south side that Olivia had used dozens of times during site visits, and that the security cameras didn't cover because it faced the loading dock, and the loading dock had its own camera system under a separate contractor. They were back in Dana's sedan 4 minutes later. Dana looked at the drive in Olivia's hand and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Gaines is waiting." "Tell him 20 minutes, Ethan said. Dana drove. For 11 minutes nobody spoke, and then Olivia said quietly, almost to herself, "We actually did it." "We got the files," Ethan said. "Don't celebrate yet." She looked at him. He didn't say it to diminish anything. She could read that in his face. He said it because it was true, and because he'd learned a long time ago that the moment you decided the hard part was over was frequently the moment the hardest part began. He was right. Dana's phone rang as they turned onto the expressway. She answered on the car's speaker before checking who it was, which was unlike her. Dana was the kind of person who looked before picking up, which meant she'd already been expecting this call and had forgotten protocol for a second. It was one of her paralegals. The voice was careful, measured in the way of someone delivering information they know will land badly. "A filing came through the federal court system 20 minutes ago," the paralegal said. "Emergency petition. It's Dana. It names Ethan Mercer as a paid consultant to Sterling Global, alleging he was retained 6 months ago to assist in document manipulation and financial record falsification." The car was quiet. "That's fabricated," Olivia said immediately, her voice sharp. "I know," the paralegal said, "but it's filed. It's on the record. And if it gains traction before you can present the real evidence, it separates us," Ethan said. He said it flatly, without heat, because it was true, and getting upset about it didn't change what it was. "If I'm named in a federal filing as a co-conspirator, anything I touch becomes contaminated. The files we just pulled, the operational support I've provided. Hawthorne's lawyers will argue it's all tainted by my involvement." Dana was already dialing with one hand, the car steady at highway speed, her face composed in a way that suggested she was operating well past the normal limits of what a person could process at one time. "I'm calling Gaines directly. This changes the sequencing." "How?" Olivia asked. "We need to establish Ethan's clean status before we hand over the files. If Gaines takes the files from a man with an active federal allegation against him, even a fabricated one, the chain of custody is compromised and Hawthorne's attorneys will tie it up for months." Dana got through to Gaines. 2 minutes of precise, rapid conversation, Dana's voice never once breaking from its calibrated calm. When she hung up, "Gaines can put a hold on the filing on the basis of it being filed without supporting documentation, which it is, because there is no supporting documentation because it's invented. But the hold takes 4 hours to process." 4 hours. Ethan did the math. 32 hours until the board vote. "Then we have time," Olivia said. "Barely," Dana said, "but we have it." Ethan was watching the expressway unroll ahead of them. He was thinking about something Vic had said. The bracket doesn't leave loose ends. The forged filing was fast, too fast. It had been prepared in advance, ready to deploy the moment they knew Ethan was involved, which meant the bracket had anticipated this specific scenario. Ethan helping someone get to the files, which meant they'd known, probably from the moment those contractors recognized his face in the alley, that the situation had shifted into something that required more than 4 men with earpieces. "There's someone else we need," he said. Dana glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Olivia turned in the passenger seat. "The security commander at Sterling Global," he said. "The man running the contracted team. You know who that is?" Olivia thought for a second. "Trevor Kane. He was brought in 8 months ago. Direct recommendation from Hawthorne." "He knows where the bodies are buried," Ethan said. "Literally, maybe. Definitely figuratively. If Kane turns, if we can get him to turn, his testimony plus your files makes the fabricated filing irrelevant. It makes everything Hawthorne built irrelevant." "Why would Kane turn?" Dana asked. "Because he's not Brackett. He's hired. And hired people, when they understand that the people who hired them are going to lose and that losing means everyone in the structure gets charged, have a very clear incentive to be the person who cooperated first." Ethan paused. "I need to talk to him." He's inside the Sterling Global building, Olivia said. We can't just— Not inside the building, Ethan said. Kane has a routine. Men like him always have a routine because routine is how they manage the anxiety of what they do. I need his schedule. Olivia was already thinking. He runs. Every morning, the lakefront path. I've seen him. We have executive parking near Millennium Park and he's there by 7, still in running clothes. It always struck me as— She paused. He was watching the building from a distance. I thought it was dedication. Now I think it was something else. He's been uncomfortable with this for a while, Ethan said. That's good. Uncomfortable people are reachable. Dana pulled off the expressway, navigating toward the address where Gaines had agreed to meet. The city moved outside the windows, ordinary and enormous, full of people whose day was entirely unlike this one. In the back seat, Olivia held the drive against her palm. Ethan watched the road. Neither of them said anything, but the silence had a different quality than the silences earlier in the day. Not tense, not careful. More like two people who had been through something together and were now in the brief space between things, before the next thing started. Your daughter, Olivia said after a while. Is she safe? She's with a neighbor. She thinks I'm on a job. Does she know about who you were? She knows I was Navy, he said. She knows there's more than that, and she's decided not to ask yet. She will someday. He paused. She's smarter than I deserve. Olivia was quiet for a moment. My father used to say that about me. Her voice was even. He said it like it was the best thing that ever happened to him. She looked out the window. I used to think it was just something fathers said. It's not, Ethan said. She didn't answer, and he didn't say anything more, and the car moved through the city toward whatever came next, carrying two people who were still in the middle of something that hadn't finished with either of them yet. Gaines was waiting in a parking structure 3 blocks from the federal building. A careful man, meeting in a careful place, with the particular watchfulness of someone who had been in federal investigations long enough to know that public spaces created public records. He was 50-something, unremarkable in appearance in the specific way of people who had cultivated unremarkability professionally. He looked at the drive in Olivia's hand, then at Ethan, and his expression shifted in a way that suggested Vic Salloway had already told him things Ethan hadn't known were being transmitted. Glass Tower, Gaines said, looking at Ethan. That's old, Ethan said. Not as old as we thought, Gaines said. Nothing about this is. He took the drive. He confirmed the 4-hour hold on the fabricated filing. He said things about the board vote and the injunction and the federal timeline that Dana recorded in her notepad with steady efficiency. And then he said something that none of them had expected, something that sat in the air of the parking structure for a moment before anyone responded. We have a surveillance record of Hawthorne meeting with a federal official 6 months before Glass Tower was shut down. Same official who authorized the shutdown order. The silence after that was the kind that changes the shape of things. Ethan said, Who? Someone who retired 3 years ago, Gaines said. Someone who can't hurt you anymore. He paused. But now you know it wasn't budget constraints. It wasn't budget constraints. He'd suspected for 8 years, and now it wasn't a suspicion. And the feeling that came with confirmed knowledge was not the relief he'd sometimes imagined it would be. It was quieter than that. More like the particular exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a long time and finally being told you can put it down. He put it down. Internally. As much as a person could, standing in a parking structure in Chicago with 19 hours until a board vote that was going to determine whether justice happened or money won again. He looked at Gaines. What do you need from us in the next 12 hours? And they got back to work. Gaines gave them a list before they left the parking structure. Not a long list, 5 items, written in his own handwriting on the back of a parking receipt because he didn't use notepads for things he didn't want in a discoverable record. 5 specific pieces of corroborating material that would allow him to move from preliminary finding to formal federal action, and the most critical of them was Trevor Kane, not Kane's testimony alone. Gaines needed Kane on record, in a format that met evidentiary standards, before 10 o'clock the following morning. Everything else, the drive, the financial records, the shell company documentation, built the structural case. But financial crimes at this level, Gaines explained, with the patience of a man who had watched too many prosecutions fail on procedural grounds, required human confirmation. a witness who had been inside the operation. Someone who could tell a federal judge not just what the document showed, but what the people involved had said, decided, and ordered in rooms where documents weren't kept. Kane was that person, if they could get to him. Ethan spent the drive back across the city working through what he knew about the man from the fragments Olivia and Dana had provided. Trevor Kane, 53, former Army intelligence, 2 decades in private corporate security before Hawthorne had recruited him 18 months ago. The running habit, the early mornings at the lakefront. Those details mattered less as biography and more as signal. Men who maintained rigid physical routines in high-stress operational environments were usually men who needed a fixed point, something that was entirely theirs, uncontaminated by whoever they were working for. It was a form of private integrity. Not always. Sometimes it was just vanity or habit. But in Ethan's experience, the men who kept those rituals while doing things they knew were wrong were the ones who hadn't yet fully committed to being wrong. They were keeping a door open. They just needed someone to come through it. He explained this to Olivia in the car. She listened, then said, "You're describing yourself." He hadn't expected that. He sat with it for a moment. Maybe. 8 years of tow trucks and brake jobs, she said. Your fixed point. And Cora. And Cora, she agreed. She looked out the window at the city moving past. Kane has a daughter too. I saw a photo on his desk once when I was reviewing his onboarding file. Little girl, maybe 7 or 8. He had it turned so visitors could see it, which I always thought was either sentimental or a performance. Or both, Ethan said. People are usually both. The lakefront plan required timing they didn't fully control. Kane ran in the morning. It was now early afternoon. They had one shot at an approach. Not tonight, not after dark, because a man in Kane's position, with the operational awareness his background guaranteed, would clock an approach in a low-visibility setting as hostile before the first word was spoken. It had to be the morning. 6:45, the lakefront path, the way you'd encounter someone by accident if you happened to be running the same stretch of path at the same hour. Except that tomorrow morning, the board meeting started at 10, which meant the window between Kane and the boardroom was exactly 3 hours and 15 minutes, with federal courthouse logistics in the middle. It's tight, Dana said. Everything about this is tight, Ethan said. Dana dropped them at a hotel on the near north side. Not a sterling global property, not anything adjacent to their usual geography. She'd booked 2 rooms under her paralegal's name, paying cash from a firm account she'd restructured that morning for exactly this kind of operational necessity. Corporate attorneys in high-stakes situations, Ethan was learning, developed a particular category of competence that existed in the gray space between legal and necessary. Dana lived in that space with complete comfort. The rooms were adjacent, 3rd floor, overlooking an alley. Not luxurious. Ethan stood at the window of his room and looked at the alley and thought about the alley behind his shop where this had started, which felt like a week ago and had been less than 40 hours. He called Vic. Kane, he said when Vic picked up. Already on it, Vic said. He's been cooperative with one federal inquiry already. 2 years ago, different company. He provided background information to an investigator looking at a contractor fraud case. He wasn't a named source. It was informal. But the investigator noted in his file that Kane was, quote, conflicted about his current professional situation, unquote. A pause. That's federal investigator language for a man who wants out and doesn't know how. Can you get me a direct contact? Something personal, not the Sterling Global channels. He has a cell number registered to a plan under his sister's name in Naperville. Standard operational security for someone who doesn't want his employer monitoring his calls. Vic gave him the number. Ethan, he's going to be cautious. I know. He's also going to be scared. Whatever you say to him in the first 30 seconds either opens it or closes it permanently. I know that too. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed for 10 minutes before he dialed, not hesitating, preparing. There was a difference. He was thinking about the right door, the one that was already slightly open, and how to put his hand on it without pushing so hard it swung shut. He dialed. Kane picked up on the 4th ring. Silence first, the silence of a man checking the number and not recognizing it, and answering anyway because you always had to answer unknown numbers in his line of work because sometimes they were important. Kane, he said, just the name. My name is Ethan Mercer, Ethan said. I'm calling because I think you've been waiting for this call for about 6 months. And I'd rather have this conversation now than tomorrow when the options are narrower for both of us. A long pause. Not hanging up, Ethan could hear him breathing, hear the ambient sound of wherever he was, an indoor space, air conditioning, low voices somewhere in the background. I don't know who you are, Kane said. His voice was controlled, professionally flat. You do, Ethan said. Your people recognized my face 2 nights ago in Pilsen. I know they reported back to you, which means you've known my name since yesterday morning. Another pause, shorter this time. What do you want? Kane said. The same thing you want, Ethan said. For this to end before someone else gets hurt, and before the people who built this walk away clean while everyone below them takes the weight. He paused. You have a daughter. The silence that followed was different from the other silences. Fuller. Don't, Kane said. The word was quiet and not a threat. It was a man saying, don't bring that into this, with the specific pain of someone who'd been bringing it into this against his will every day for months. I'm not using it as leverage, Ethan said. I'm using it as a reason, because it's the same reason I left the work I used to do. And it's the reason you're still answering phones at midnight instead of sleeping, and it's the reason you didn't let your people go through that side door in Pilsen when you knew where she was. Another silence. They would have gone in, Ethan said. You held them back. I pulled them back because it was a residential area and escalation wasn't authorized, Kane said, but the words came out with the flatness of a man reciting a justification he'd already stopped believing. Okay, Ethan said. He didn't argue. Federal investigators have the financial documentation. They have the shell company records, the payment trails, the internal communications. What they need is someone who was inside the operation, someone who can put voice and decision-making behind the documents. He paused. The first person who cooperates gets the best deal. That's not a theory. That's how every federal prosecution at this level has worked for the last 30 years. He waited. Kane was quiet for so long that Ethan thought he'd lost him. Then, if I talk to them, federal investigators, not local. Federal. Financial Crimes Division, a man named Gaines. When? Tonight if possible. Tomorrow morning at the latest, but the board meeting is at 10 and the window closes when it starts. I need... Kane stopped, started again. I need assurances. In writing. Before I say anything on record. Gaines can give you those. That's his authority. Another pause. I'm not going to prison for Hawthorne. You won't, Ethan said. Not if you move now. He could hear Kane breathing, could hear him making the calculation that everyone in this position had to make, the one where you weighed what you'd done against what you could still prevent and tried to find a number that let you live with yourself. Tomorrow morning, Kane said. 6:30. The lakefront path at Monroe Harbor. Come alone. I'll be there. Kane hung up. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he called Gaines, relayed the conversation, and listened to Gaines say things about procedural arrangements and recording authorization and witness protection protocols in the calm, efficient way of a man who had just received information that moved his timeline forward by approximately 8 hours. When he knocked on the door connecting his room to the adjacent one, Olivia opened it immediately. She'd been awake, sitting at the small desk with a notepad, working through something. She looked at his face and said, He said yes. 6:30 tomorrow, Monroe Harbor. She exhaled. It wasn't relief exactly. Too much was still unresolved for relief. But something. The particular release of a tension that had been held for so long, the body had stopped registering it as tension and started experiencing it as baseline. You should sleep, he said. You keep saying that. You keep not doing it. She looked at him for a moment. There was something she wanted to say. He could see it in the way she held herself, the slight adjustment of posture that meant a person was deciding whether to cross into more personal territory. She decided. When this is over, she said, when it's actually over and the legal process is running and I'm back in that building with my name on the door, I'm going to have to figure out how to be someone who deserved to keep it. He didn't tell her she already deserved it. That would have been the easy thing, and she would have recognized it as empty. Yeah, he said, you will. That's not a comforting answer. No. She almost smiled. Good night, Ethan. Good night. He slept 4 hours, which was more than he'd expected and enough to function well. He was up at 5:15, dressed by 5:30, and standing at the lakefront path at Monroe Harbor by 6:10, watching the sky over Lake Michigan go through its slow transformation from dark to the particular gray-pink of an early Chicago morning, the water flat and enormous and indifferent to everything happening on its edge. Kane arrived at 6:28, running clothes, earbuds around his neck rather than in his ears. He'd wanted to hear the path clearly. He was bigger than Ethan had pictured, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who'd maintained physical conditioning out of necessity rather than vanity, with a face that had been outdoors a lot and showed it. He slowed as he reached the bench where Ethan was sitting, stopped, looked at him without hostility. "You're older than the file photo," Kane said. "The file photo is 8 years old." "You look like you had a hard 8 years." "Some of them." Kane sat down on the far end of the bench. He looked at the water. "I want to tell you something before we do this formally." Ethan waited. "The night you pulled her out of that alley," Kane said, "I had 4 people on the street, 2 more positioned at the north and south end of the block. Standard containment." He paused. "I called them off. All of them. After we made your face." He looked at Ethan. "Not because I was afraid of you." "Then why?" "Because we'd already gone further than I—" He stopped, looked at the water again. "Hawthorne told me this was a rogue CEO running a cover operation against the board. I believed it, or I told myself I did, long enough to get set up in the position. Then I started seeing the actual documentation, started understanding what the money was doing." His jaw shifted. "And then I found out about Marcus Sterling." Ethan didn't move. "I'm not naive," Kane said. "I've done work in my life that I don't put in the clean column. But there are lines." He looked at Ethan. "I need you to know I didn't know about Marcus Sterling when I took this job. I found out 4 months ago." "What did you do when you found out?" "I started keeping records," Kane said. "Every meeting, every instruction, every communication I could access. Encrypted, stored off-site. Nothing on any Sterling global system." He looked at his own hands. "I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I just knew I wasn't going to be the only one holding the bag when this came apart." He reached into the small zipped pocket of his running jacket and took out a drive, smaller than the one from the server room. He held it for a moment before holding it out. Ethan took it. 43 recordings, Kane said. 11 of them include Hawthorne directly. 3 of those discuss Marcus Sterling explicitly. One of them, he paused. One of them is a conversation between Hawthorne and a man I only know as the bracket's operational director, discussing what happens if Olivia Sterling reaches federal investigators before the board vote. He paused again. The word they used was not legal action. Ethan looked at the drive. He thought about Olivia in that alley, running in one heel, with a tracking device on her back and 4 contractors closing the distance. He thought about how this could have ended differently on any of a dozen decision points in the last 40 hours. "I'll get this to Gaines this morning," he said. "I want the cooperation agreement in place before I speak to anyone on record," Kane said. "I know how this works. I want it in writing, signed, before I open my mouth." "Gaines will have it ready." Kane nodded. He looked back at the lake. "She's not what Hawthorne said she was. Olivia Sterling." He said the name like he'd been thinking about her as a real person for a while. He made her sound like a liability, a problem to be managed. "I've seen the way she runs that company from the inside, and she's not that." "No," Ethan said. "She's not. She ignored some things she shouldn't have ignored. But that's different." He looked at Ethan. "You know it's different." Gaines met them at 7:15 in the federal building, in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee. The cooperation agreement was ready. Dana had worked with Gaines's office through the night to draft it, and it was thorough in the way that documents prepared under time pressure by very competent people tended to be. Not perfect, but functional, covering the essential protections that Kane needed and the essential commitments that the federal case required. Kane read it twice, asked 2 specific questions that suggested he'd dealt with federal agreements before and knew where the language could be slippery, received 2 direct answers that satisfied him, and signed. Then he talked for 90 minutes. Ethan sat in the corner of the room and listened. Not because he needed to hear it, he knew enough of the shape of it already, but because some things needed to be witnessed. Kane was precise, methodical, and visibly exhausted in the way of someone putting down a weight they'd been carrying alone for months. He had dates, names, meeting locations. He had the recordings on the drive, which Gaines's technical team began processing immediately. He had the bracket's operational structure as he understood it from the inside. Not complete, not the full architecture, but enough of the load-bearing walls that Gaines could see where the rest was. And he had a name, the operational director. The man on the recording with Hawthorne who had discussed what happened if Olivia reached federal investigators. The name was in 3 of the recordings, used casually, the way people use names when they'd stopped being careful. Gaines wrote it down and passed the paper to his deputy without a word. The deputy left the room. At 9:05, Dana called. Her voice was clipped but not alarmed. "The board meeting starts in 55 minutes, she said. Hawthorne is already in the building. He's been there since 8. He's moved up the vote sequence. It's the first item, not the third. He's anticipating something." "He knows we got the files," Ethan said. "Probably. The distribution center flagged an anomalous entry after we left. Someone reviewed the camera records and noticed the maintenance corridor access. They'd have reported to him." Dana paused. "He doesn't know about Kane. And he doesn't know about Gaines's injunction application, which is being submitted to the federal court in..." He heard her check something. 14 minutes. "Will the injunction land before the vote?" "It's going to be very close. The court has to process the application, the judge has to review the preliminary finding, and the filing has to be transmitted to Sterling Global's registered legal address." A pause. "Gaines's office has already been in contact with the court's emergency clerk. They're prioritizing it. But Ethan, if there's any procedural delay, even 20 minutes, Hawthorne could get the vote through before the injunction is served." Ethan was already standing. Across the room, Gaines looked at him and seemed to read the situation from his posture alone, because Gaines held up 2 fingers, 2 minutes, and gestured toward the door. Olivia was in the hallway, sitting in one of the institutional chairs outside the conference room, because she'd been excluded from Kane's formal deposition to maintain the integrity of the witness statement. She'd been there for 90 minutes without complaint, with nothing but her own thoughts and a cup of bad coffee that she'd long since finished. She looked up when Ethan came through the door. "We have to go," he said. "Now, the vote." She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. They took Dana's car again. Dana drove with the focused aggression of someone who had decided that traffic laws were a strong suggestion rather than an absolute. And Ethan sat in the back with Olivia and went through the sequence with her, the injunction, what it would mean if it arrived in time. What happened if it didn't? "If it doesn't land in time," Olivia said, "and the vote passes, then we contest it immediately with the federal filing as grounds," Dana said from the front seat. "The vote can be reversed if it was cast under fraudulent circumstances. It's more complicated. It takes longer, but it's not over." "But Hawthorne gets to run the company during the contest period," Olivia said. "Yes. And during that period, every document that's not already in federal hands is at risk." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then we can't let the vote happen." The Sterling Global headquarters was a 40-story tower on Walker Drive, glass and steel, the company name in polished letters above the lobby entrance. Ethan had never been inside it. He'd driven past it hundreds of times. It was the kind of building you drove past in Chicago without thinking about it, part of the skyline furniture. Now he was getting out of a car in front of it at 9:28, with 32 minutes until a vote that would determine whether the last 3 days had meant anything. The lobby security desk had 3 guards. Standard corporate building configuration, 2 seated, 1 standing near the elevator bank. Olivia walked towards them with her employee badge, still active, because Hawthorne had moved to suspend her authority, but hadn't yet moved to deactivate her building access, which was either an oversight or the product of bureaucratic lag. And the guard at the desk looked up with the complicated expression of a man recognizing a face he'd been told was a problem and not having a specific protocol for what to do about it. "Miss Sterling," he said. "Good morning," she said, with the specific tone of a CEO entering her own building. "I need access to the executive floor." There's a note here that, "Is my badge functional?" she asked. He checked the reader. Yes, it's showing active." "Then I'm going up." She looked at him with the calm of someone who had been dealing with institutional friction her entire career and had developed a specific patience for it. "If Mr. Hawthorne has an issue with that, he can raise it with my attorney, who is..." She looked at Dana, standing to her left. "Right here." The guard looked at Dana. Dana looked at the guard with the expression of someone who had 17 relevant statutes memorized and was deciding which one to cite first. They went through. The elevators opened onto the executive floor. 38th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view that on a clear day reached to Indiana. The boardroom was at the north end, a room Olivia had walked into hundreds of times, a room where her father had once sat at the head of the table and made decisions about a company he'd built with 30 years of accumulated stubbornness. The door was closed. Through the glass panel beside it, Ethan could see figures inside. Board members, 7 of them, seated around the long table. Hawthorne at the far end, in Marcus Sterling's chair. He was speaking. His face had the relaxed authority of a man who had not yet encountered a problem he hadn't anticipated. Ethan's phone buzzed. Dana's paralegal. Injunction filed with court. 9:31. Processing time unknown. 9:31. He pushed the boardroom door open. The room turned. 7 faces, plus Hawthorne's, plus 2 attorneys seated against the wall. The particular silence of a room whose air pressure changes when something unexpected enters it. Hawthorne looked at Olivia first, then at Ethan. His expression moved through surprise and landed in contempt, which told Ethan that Hawthorne had been told about him but hadn't taken the threat seriously enough. "This meeting is not open to," Hawthorne's attorney started. "This meeting is not legal," Dana said, coming through the door behind them. She set her briefcase on the side table and opened it with a snap that cut through the room. "I have federal documentation indicating that at least 2 members of this board are subjects of an active financial crimes investigation. Under Illinois corporate law and federal oversight statutes, a board vote involving conflicted members is subject to immediate injunction. The filing is in process as of 9:31 this morning." "You don't have an injunction," Hawthorne said. His voice was controlled, practiced. He'd been in rooms like this his whole career, and he knew how to hold ground. "You have a filing. Filings take time, and in the time it takes—" He looked at the board members around the table. "We proceed." "Richard?" Olivia spoke for the first time since entering the room. She didn't shout. She didn't perform. She just said his name, and the way she said it made 3 of the board members look at her instead of him, which was its own kind of shift. Hawthorne looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who had dismissed her 1,000 times and had never once updated that assessment. "Sit down, Olivia," he said. "The adults are working." "We have 43 recordings," she said. "Trevor Kane began cooperating with federal investigators at 7:15 this morning. The recordings include 11 conversations involving you directly. 3 of them discuss my father." She paused. "By name. And what you needed to happen to him." The room was absolutely still. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Ellison, who had sat on the Sterling board for 11 years, and who Ethan had registered as the one face that had shown something other than either alignment with Hawthorne or paralyzed neutrality, said quietly, "Richard." It wasn't a question. It was the sound of someone arriving at a conclusion they'd been avoiding. Hawthorne's composure held. That was the thing about men who built what he'd built. They didn't break in rooms. They'd been trained by long practice to maintain the surface even when everything beneath it was coming apart. "Kane is a disgruntled employee making false statements to avoid his own liability," Hawthorne said. "Whatever he's told federal investigators is corroborated by financial documentation, shell company records, and biometric evidence proving that signatures attributed to me on multiple internal filings were digitally forged," Olivia said. "We have all of it. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division has had it since yesterday afternoon." She looked at the board members, not at Hawthorne. She'd made a decision, Ethan realized. She was talking to the room, not to him. Hawthorne was already gone. The question was who else understood that yet. "I know some of you didn't know the full picture," she said. "I know some of you were given information that made this seem like a governance issue rather than what it actually was. That will matter in how the federal investigation proceeds." She looked at Patricia Ellison. "It matters now." Patricia Ellison looked at the 2 attorneys against the wall and said, "I'm not voting on anything until I've spoken to independent legal counsel." 2 more board members echoed versions of the same. The room was reconstituting itself, the geometry of it shifting in real time, the alignment that Hawthorne had spent months constructing coming apart at the load-bearing points. Hawthorne looked at Ethan. He'd been looking at Olivia, at Dana, at the board members. But now he looked directly at Ethan, The way a man looks at whatever he considers the source of his problems. His expression wasn't afraid. It was the cold contempt of someone who had decided to reframe losing as a temporary inconvenience. "You're a mechanic," he said. Not loudly, just stated, like it settled something. Ethan looked at him. He thought about several responses and discarded all of them because none of them mattered, and the man didn't deserve the energy. "I'm the guy who found your tracking device," Ethan said. The door opened behind them. 4 federal agents, led by Gaines, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this many times and had long since stopped finding it dramatic. Gaines looked at Hawthorne. He had a document in his hand. He set it on the table in front of Hawthorne and said his name, first and last, and began reciting the language that ended things. 2 of Hawthorne's board allies stood up as if to object and sat back down when agents moved to positions that made objection impractical. The attorneys against the wall were already on their phones. Patricia Ellison was watching Olivia with an expression that Ethan couldn't fully read, but that seemed to contain, beneath its professionalism, something like relief. The injunction notification came through on Dana's phone at 9:57, 3 minutes before the vote would have been called. Dana looked at it and then looked at Ethan and didn't say anything because there was nothing to add. The math spoke for itself. Outside the windows, Chicago continued in every direction, enormous and indifferent, full of people going about the business of ordinary days. The lake was a flat silver line at the horizon. Below, on Walker Drive, the street noise was a low continuous hum that reached the 38th floor as something close to silence. Ethan watched Hawthorne being walked toward the door between 2 federal agents, and he felt, not satisfaction exactly, something quieter. The particular sensation of a thing that should have been finished 8 years ago finally, actually, reaching its end. Olivia was standing near the head of the table, the chair that had been Marcus Sterling's and then falsely Hawthorne's, and now nobody's yet. She wasn't sitting in it. She was just standing near it, looking at the table, at the room, at the city through the windows, and the expression on her face was complicated in the specific way that the expressions of people who've just survived something tend to be. Not celebration, not simple relief, but the early, uncertain arrival at the other side of something that had taken everything to get through. She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her from across the room. Her attorney was talking. Federal agents were managing the room. 2 board members were on phones, and 1 was asking a question that nobody was answering yet. The ordinary machinery of aftermath was beginning to turn. None of it touched the moment between them, which was brief and said nothing and said everything, the way some moments did when you'd been through enough together that words had temporarily run out of work to do. Then Dana said her name, and Olivia turned toward the sound, and Ethan moved toward the door because there were things still to manage and the morning wasn't finished, and it wouldn't be finished for a long time yet. But the center of it, the thing that had needed to be done, was done. His phone buzzed. A text from Cora. "Ruth made lasagna. She puts raisins in it. This is a human rights issue. Come home." He almost laughed. He typed back, "On my way soon. Don't eat the raisins." He put his phone in his pocket. He walked toward the elevator. Behind him, the boardroom was full of the sounds of a reckoning settling into its ordinary procedural form, which was not exciting and was not meant to be. Justice at its operational level was almost always boring. That was perhaps the point, that it ground forward regardless of whether it was dramatic, regardless of whether it felt proportionate to what had come before it. He pressed the elevator button and waited, a man with grease-stained hands in a 38th floor boardroom, and when the elevator came, he got in and went down. The elevator took a long time to reach the lobby, or it felt that way. Ethan stood in it alone, watching the floor numbers count down, and in the silence between 38 and 1, he felt the particular deflation that always followed high-stakes operations. Not depression, not regret, just the body's honest accounting when the adrenaline debt came due all at once. His lower back ached. His right hand, where the socket wrench had cut him 2 days ago, had a dull throb he'd been ignoring since the basement in Wicker Park. He was tired in a way that went past the physical, the kind of tired that lived in the decision-making parts of the brain, the parts that had been running without rest for 40-odd hours. The lobby doors opened and he walked out into the ordinary morning. Wacker Drive received him with complete indifference. Taxis, delivery trucks, a woman walking a dog that was trying to investigate every parking meter, 2 men in construction vests eating sandwiches on a retaining wall. The city in its 9:58 Tuesday morning configuration, doing what cities did, continuing regardless of what had just happened on the 38th floor of one of its buildings. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Then he called Ruth Kasparian and told her he was heading back. Then he texted Cora that the raisins were Ruth's signature move and had been for 30 years and she should eat them with respect. Then he walked 3 blocks to where he'd left the prepaid phone in Dana's car, which was parked in a structure off Adams, retrieved his things, and stood in the concrete quiet of the parking structure for a few minutes, just letting his mind run down. He thought about his shop, about the Ford F-250 with the differential seal, which he had in fact completed before all of this started, and which the landscaping company had picked up sometime yesterday morning, leaving a check in the lockbox by the side door per their usual arrangement. He thought about what else was waiting. A Honda Civic with a brake line issue, a fleet van from a catering company that needed its transmission looked at, the perpetually deferred project of repainting the bay doors before winter made it impossible. Normal work. Work that had a beginning and an end and a clear measure of whether you'd done it right. He thought about what Gaines had told him in the parking structure the day before. The glass tower shutdown, the federal official, the meeting with Hawthorne 6 months before the operation was killed. He'd spent 8 years carrying the weight of an operation that had failed, and part of that weight had been the private suspicion, never confirmed, never spoken aloud except in the most oblique way to Vic, that the failure hadn't been accidental. Now he knew it wasn't. Now he knew that the thing he'd built, and the people who'd trusted his leadership, and the months of work that had come apart in a single phone call from a deputy director he'd never met, all of that had been deliberately dismantled by someone with a financial interest in the bracket's survival. Knowing it didn't undo it. That wasn't how knowing things worked. Lauren was still gone. The years were still spent. Glass Tower was still a closed file in a federal archive somewhere. But there was a specific kind of psychological weight that came from carrying an unresolved question, and that weight was different from the weight of carrying a resolved one. He could put down the question now. What remained was still heavy, but it was honest weight, the weight of things that had actually happened, not the weight of things he couldn't be sure about. He drove back to Pilsen in a car he'd borrowed from Vic's contact the night before, a 10-year-old Buick that handled like a very large and decisive couch. And he pulled into the alley behind his shop at 11:15 in the morning and sat there for a moment with the engine running, looking at the back of the building. The fire door he'd taken Olivia through 2 nights ago. The chain-link fence with the gap in the corner. The ordinary back end of an ordinary small business on an ordinary block. He went inside. The shop smelled like oil and metal and the particular mechanical familiarity that had been his version of home for 8 years. He stood in the middle of the bay for a moment, just standing, and something in him settled in a way that nothing in a hotel room or a federal parking structure or a 38th floor boardroom had been able to settle. He got the Honda Civic's file off the workbench and got to work. He worked for 3 hours. The brake line was straightforward, the diagnosis had been correct, the repair was clean, and by 2 in the afternoon the car was done and he'd started on the fleet van's preliminary transmission inspection. Ruth brought Cora back at 3, and Cora came through the shop door with the particular energy of someone who had questions she'd been holding for hours and had decided this was the moment.
Dad. Yeah. What actually happened? He looked up from the van. She was 14, standing in the doorway in her school clothes from yesterday, because apparently going to Ruth's had not involved going back to the apartment for fresh clothes, with her arms crossed and her mother's eyes, and the expression she'd developed somewhere around age 11 for when she'd decided she deserved a straight answer. I helped someone who needed it, he said. Is that all you're going to tell me? For now. She looked at him for a long moment, doing the thing she did where she assessed whether pushing further was worth the effort. She decided it wasn't, which was wisdom beyond her years. Are you okay? I'm fine. You look terrible. Thank you, Cora. Ruth's raisins are actually good. I'm not admitting that in writing. She disappeared up the back stairs to the apartment. He almost laughed again. He was finding that he almost laughed more in the hour after coming home than he had in the preceding 2 days combined, which was probably something a person should pay attention to. The federal process moved the way federal processes did, steadily, impersonally, without drama. In the days that followed, Gaines's office issued formal charges against Richard Hawthorne and 2 other board members whose involvement the documentation and Kane's testimony confirmed.
The bracket's operational director, the name on Kane's recording, was taken into federal custody in a hotel in Phoenix, where he'd been apparently preparing to leave the country, an exit that the federal hold on Hawthorne's assets and the activation of Gaines's full investigative authority had preempted with approximately 4 hours to spare. Vic Salloway, whose 12 years of peripheral surveillance on the bracket structure suddenly became one of the most valuable intelligence resources in the investigation, spent 3 weeks in Washington providing briefings that he described to Ethan in a single text as exhausting and overdue. The fabricated filing naming Ethan as a co-conspirator was formally withdrawn within 72 hours, as Gaines's preliminary finding made it legally untenable. Trevor Kane received his cooperation agreement in full, which meant reduced charges, no prison time, and a period of monitored compliance that his attorney negotiated with the particularity of someone who had read every page of the relevant precedent. Kane called Ethan once during this period, briefly, to say something that didn't require much in response. Ethan said what needed to be said, and they left it there. Some things between men who have done difficult work in proximity to each other don't need to be extended beyond their natural length. Sterling Global entered a period that the financial press described variously as turbulent restructuring and governance overhaul and landmark corporate recovery, depending on which outlet was writing about it and what narrative served their readership. What it actually was, inside the building, was harder and less dramatic than any of those descriptions. It was a company discovering the full extent of what had been done to it, which was a process that produced more paperwork than catharsis, more committee meetings than breakthrough moments, more quiet conversations in hallways than public reckoning. Olivia ran it. That was the simple version. The more accurate version was that she ran it the way someone runs something they've decided to earn rather than simply reclaim, carefully, with an awareness of what her authority cost and what it was supposed to serve, with a specific willingness to be uncomfortable in ways she'd previously avoided. She called a full company assembly in the third week, 260 employees in the distribution center's main floor, standing room, plus another 400 connected remotely across the regional offices. She spoke for 22 minutes without notes, which was unusual for her. She'd always prepared remarks, always had a structure, always known what she was going to say before she said it. This time, she came to the assembly knowing only what was true, and she said it. She said she had known, somewhere beneath the level of explicit knowledge, that something was wrong for longer than she'd admitted. She said the early warning signs, the irregular budget lines, the contractor appointments that bypassed normal procurement review, the subtle change in Hawthorne's behavior toward her after her father died, had been visible, and she had chosen to keep her attention on the forward-looking work instead of on the present-tense problems. She said that this was not solely a governance failure or a security failure or a failure of any particular system. It was also a personal failure, and she was the person responsible for naming it as such, because she was the person who had been given the most authority and had used some of that authority to not look at things she didn't want to see. She said the employees who had been dismissed in the preceding 18 months, 17 people whose terminations had been engineered through fabricated performance reviews, because they'd been asking the right questions or were in positions to see the financial irregularities, would be offered reinstatement with full back pay and seniority restoration. She said the 3 who didn't want to come back would receive a settlement that reflected what they'd actually lost. She said she was paying for this from her own compensation rather than from the company's operational budget, which was a detail that hadn't been announced in advance and produced a specific quality of silence in the room. She didn't make it a speech about her own growth. She made it about the company, what it owed the people who worked there, what she personally owed them, and what she intended to actually do about it, with specific timelines and accountability structures that Dana had helped her build over 3 consecutive late nights in the week prior. The accountability structures were the unglamorous part, the part that made real intentions different from performed ones. She spent 7 minutes on them. Nobody in the room got up to leave. Afterward, Patricia Ellison, who had resigned from the board immediately following the boardroom scene and was navigating her own legal consultation about her peripheral involvement, sent Olivia a 1-paragraph letter that said, in its most direct sentence, "I should have seen it sooner, and the fact that I told myself I didn't is the thing I have to live with." Olivia read it twice and wrote back a response that was 3 sentences long and true. She didn't forgive Patricia Ellison in the letter. She wasn't sure forgiveness was hers to grant, for most of it, but she acknowledged the letter honestly, and that was its own kind of thing. The investigation into Marcus Sterling's death was opened formally as a connected inquiry by a different federal division 8 weeks after Hawthorne's arrest. Ethan heard about it from Vic, who heard about it from the kind of channels Vic maintained. He told Olivia when she called him the following Thursday. She called him periodically through this period, never for long, usually with a specific question or update. In the practical mode they'd both settled into because neither of them quite knew what the other register was yet. She was quiet for a moment after he told her. Then she said, "I don't know if I want them to confirm it." "You don't have to know yet," he said. "That's not how investigations work. The investigation doesn't need you to know how you feel about it. It'll proceed either way." He paused. "I just meant you don't have to decide today what to do with whatever they find." Another pause. "You're surprisingly good at this." "At what?" "Not trying to fix the things that can't be fixed." He thought about that for a moment. "I've had practice," he said. And she understood what he meant, and they left it there. He didn't see her for 2 months after the boardroom. The calls happened, 8 or 9 of them, short, functional, occasionally sliding into something less functional and more honest before one of them pulled it back toward the practical, because neither of them had decided yet what to do with the less functional part. He went back to his shop and his work, and Cora and Ruth's pasta and the Honda Civic and the fleet van, and a growing backlog of late-season tow jobs as the weather started to turn. He coached one session of a youth soccer clinic at the park 3 blocks over, filling in for a coach who'd called out sick, and found that he'd missed it, the specific absurdity of explaining offsides to 12-year-olds who were simultaneously trying to watch a squirrel. He told Cora more about the 2 days eventually. Not everything, some of it wasn't hers to carry, but enough that she understood why he'd been gone and why Ruth's lasagna had been part of the solution. She listened the way she always listened, which was more carefully than she let on, and at the end she said, "So you saved a CEO." "She mostly saved herself," he said. "I just helped with some of the logistics." Cora gave him the look she reserved for when he was being deliberately modest, in a way she found transparently dishonest. "Dad." "Yeah." "Is she nice?" He considered that. "She's honest," he said, "which is harder to be and more valuable." Cora processed this with the efficiency of someone who had grown up translating her father's compressed emotional vocabulary. "Do you like her?" "She's a good person." "That's not what I asked." He looked at his daughter, who was going to be entirely too smart for his peace of mind for the next decade, at minimum, and didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. And Cora accepted it with the tolerant patience of someone who had learned that the information would arrive when it arrived. The first cold snap of November came on a Friday, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in an afternoon the way Chicago weather did, without negotiation, without warning, simply as a fact that the city presented and expected you to accommodate. Ethan was in the shop at 6 in the evening, the bay doors pulled down against the wind that had come up off the lake, the radio on low, working on a 2014 Jeep that needed new rotors and had needed them for longer than the owner had wanted to admit. He heard a car slow in front of the building. He came out of the bay, wiping his hands, and saw a car he didn't recognize, a dark blue sedan, late model, parked at the curb in front of the shop, rather than in the small lot to the side. He'd been more attentive to cars he didn't recognize for the past 2 months than he'd been before all of this. It was probably a habit that would eventually fade. It hadn't yet. The driver's door opened and Olivia Sterling got out. She was dressed for the weather, a coat, a scarf, boots that looked warm and were also clearly expensive, though she wore them without the self-consciousness of someone thinking about the fact. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the shop front, at the faded sign above the door, at the light coming through the small window beside the bay door. Then she looked at him. She looked different from the last time he'd seen her in person, standing in the boardroom 2 months ago. The particular tautness of someone in a sustained crisis had left her face. She looked tired still, but it was the honest tiredness of someone doing hard, legitimate work, not the hunted tiredness of someone surviving. She looked in a way she hadn't in the basement in Wicker Park, or the parking structure, or any of the places they'd moved through together, like herself. He was suddenly aware that he was wearing clothes he'd been working in for 6 hours, and had grease on his forearms, and probably on his face, and that none of this could be helped. "I should have called," she said. "It's okay." "I was in the neighborhood." She paused. "I wasn't in the neighborhood. I drove here specifically." "I know." She looked at the tow truck parked at the side of the building, the old Mercer truck, with the faded lettering and the rust at the wheel wells and the particular battered quality of something that had been used hard and kept anyway. Is that the truck from the alley? That's it. She looked at it for a moment. He knew what she was thinking, or he thought he did. The specific strangeness of seeing in daylight the ordinary object that had been part of the most extraordinary moment of her recent life. It was a very old truck. It was not, in any objective sense, remarkable. I wanted to tell you something in person, she said. He waited. She came closer, off the sidewalk, onto the concrete apron in front of the bay doors, close enough that the wind wasn't between them anymore. Her face was serious in the way it got when she was being careful with something, when she was making sure the words did what she intended rather than just approximating it. I turned down 3 interviews in the past month, she said, where the journalist wanted the story to be about how I was rescued, the plucky CEO and the mysterious hero. One of them already had the headline written. She paused. I turned them down because that's not what happened. I wasn't rescued. I made choices, including the choice to grab a stranger's arm in an alley, and those choices led to other choices. And the choices are what mattered, not who made them look good from outside. He nodded. But you could have not opened that door, she said. You could have looked out the window and decided it was someone else's problem. You could have helped me get to the next street and then gone back upstairs to your daughter. She held his gaze. You didn't. No, he said. So I wanted to say thank you, in person, without a press release attached to it. He looked at her. The streetlight had come on above them. It was that hour, the blue hour of early November evening in a northern city where darkness arrived faster than you'd prepared for. Behind her, the street was quiet, the ordinary residential industrial mix of Pilsen in the early evening, a couple walking a dog, someone's radio from an upstairs window, the distant, reliable sound of the city, just continuing. You're welcome, he said, though I think Gaines and Kane and Vic Salloway and Dana also deserve some of it. I've thanked them, she said. Appropriately, professionally, with the correct level of formality. She paused. This is the other kind. Something in him shifted, the specific shift of a person who has been keeping a careful distance from something and has run out of reasons to maintain it. He wasn't a man who ran toward things. He'd spent 8 years making himself smaller, quieter, contained. That wasn't a wrong way to live. It had been the right way to live for a long time, for reasons that were true and important. But the reasons had been about protecting something, and what you protected had to eventually be the thing you actually lived, not just the thing you kept safe. I have a Jeep in there that still needs rotors, he said. She blinked. Okay. And Cora's upstairs. She's going to know you're here within about 4 minutes because she has supernatural awareness of anything that happens in front of this building. Is that a warning? It's information, he said. She's going to ask you things. She's not rude about it, but she doesn't really do small talk. Olivia looked at the door to the upstairs apartment, then back at him. The corners of her mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was heading there. Are you inviting me in? He thought about all the ways to answer that. He thought about the last 2 months of phone calls and the gap in the chain link fence and the tracking device and the parking structure and the boardroom. He thought about a conversation with his daughter about the difference between niceness and honesty. He thought about what it meant to have survived something with someone. Not together, exactly. Not in the way that made a good story, but in parallel, each of them choosing their own version of the next thing at every juncture and ending up at the same place anyway. There's food upstairs, he said. It's not Ruth level, but it's edible. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I could eat. He held the door. She went through it, past the crayon drawing still taped beside the light switch. The house with the sun. Daddy's shop in the handwriting of a child who was now 14 and pretended to have outgrown the need for moon-shaped lamps. And up the stairs toward the sound of Cora's music coming through the apartment floor. Some song Ethan didn't recognize, loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough to be the whole world. He followed her up. What he understood, climbing those stairs, was something that wasn't dramatic enough to be called wisdom, but was true in the way that the simple things were true. He had spent 8 years believing that the life he'd made himself, the contained, deliberate, modest life of a man who fixed things and came home and asked nothing from the world beyond enough work to pay the bills and enough time with his daughter to do it right, was the life he deserved. Not as punishment, not from self-pity, just as the honest reckoning of a man who had counted his resources and his obligations and decided that ambition was a luxury he'd already used his allotment of. But deserving wasn't really the question. Deserving was something you applied to prizes, to outcomes you'd earned through specific effort. Life wasn't a prize system. The things that came to you came because you stayed in the world long enough for them to arrive, and you opened the right doors at the right moments, and sometimes the door was a side entrance in a dark alley that changed everything. He wasn't the same person who had walked out of the Navy and buried his wife and taught himself to be invisible. He wasn't the version of himself from Glass Tower either. That person had believed in clean solutions, had believed that if you built a thing correctly, it would end correctly, and the world had disabused him of that with a phone call and a funeral and 8 years of break jobs. He was the version that had survived both of those people. Slower, more careful, more realistic about what he could and couldn't fix. But still here, still with his hands in things that needed repairing, still with his daughter upstairs listening to music he didn't recognize, still capable, he'd rediscovered this with some surprise, of walking back into something dangerous and doing something useful and coming out the other side. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Cora appeared at the top of the stairs before they reached the landing, because of course she did, and she looked at Olivia Sterling with the frank assessment of someone who had heard the abbreviated version of recent events and was now forming her own conclusions about the person at the center of them. Olivia looked back at her without the slight condescension that some adults wore around teenagers without knowing they were wearing it. "You're Cora," Olivia said. "You're the CEO," Cora said. "Technically, yes." "He said you're honest," Cora said. "He said that was more important than being nice." Olivia glanced at Ethan. He looked at the ceiling. "He's right," Olivia said, "although it's worth trying to be both." Cora considered this with the gravity she applied to things she was actually thinking about. "Do you want food? There's pasta. He made too much. He always makes too much." "I was told it was edible." "It's better than that," Cora said, with the loyalty of a daughter who would not, in front of a stranger, criticize her father's cooking. She turned and led the way to the kitchen, already explaining something about the pasta sauce and the specific argument she and her father had been having for 3 years about whether it needed more garlic, her voice carrying the ease of a person who had decided to let someone in. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, listening. He thought about the parking structure and what Gaines had told him. He thought about Glass Tower being finally, actually over, not because it had been resolved in the way he'd once imagined, with a clean conclusion and a formal acknowledgement, but because the thing it had been meant to stop had now actually been stopped, 8 years later, through a different set of people and a different set of choices. The work had mattered. It had just taken longer than anyone had planned for, and the credit had gone to no one in particular, and the outcome had arrived sideways, the way most outcomes in the real world arrived. Not triumphantly, not on schedule, not in the shape that had been imagined. He thought about Lauren. He didn't think about her every day the way he once had. The grief had changed shape over the years, becoming less like a weight and more like a presence, something that moved with him rather than pulling at him, something that was part of him without being all of him. She had been the person who convinced him, when he was 30 and certain that the work he was doing in places no one talked about was all he was built for, that he was built for more than that. She'd been right. He'd been a long time accepting it, but she'd been right. He thought about Cora, in the kitchen, offering pasta to a stranger with the uncomplicated generosity of someone who had been loved well and had learned that love was not a finite resource that cost something to extend. He thought about the tow truck with its rust and its battered flanks, parked at the side of the building where it would still be tomorrow and the day after, waiting for whoever needed it next. Then he walked into the kitchen. Olivia was at the counter, listening to Cora explain the garlic argument with the seriousness it apparently deserved, and she had her coat over the back of a chair and her scarf on the counter. And she was, in this moment, just a person in a kitchen who was hungry and had driven here specifically and wasn't pretending to be somewhere other than where she was. He got 3 bowls from the cabinet. He put the pasta on the stove. Outside, Chicago was settling into its November evening, the cold coming up from the lake, the lights of the city doing what city lights did, making their own version of the sky. In the morning, there would be work. There would be the Jeep and the rotors and the fleet van and whatever else came through the door, And there would be Cora's science project, and Ruth's opinions about the weather, and the faded letters on the sign above the bay doors that he kept meaning to repaint. There would be the federal investigation continuing through its procedural stages, the court dates, the testimony schedules, the long institutional grinding of consequence toward the people who had earned it. There would be a company trying to remember what it had been built to do, and a woman learning to lead it honestly, which was a different skill from leading it successfully and harder to teach yourself. There would be all of it, the ordinary and the difficult and the slow and the unexpected. There would be almost certainly things he hadn't planned for. He had stopped expecting that to be a problem. He set 3 bowls on the table and sat down, and the conversation in the kitchen moved around him, Cora's voice and Olivia's, talking about something that had nothing to do with corporate conspiracy or federal investigations or Navy SEALs or any of it, something about schools and whether Chicago winters were different from other city winters, and what Cora wanted to study eventually, the ordinary conversation of people who were beginning, carefully, to know each other. And Ethan listened and ate his pasta and let the evening do what evenings did when you'd stop trying to control what they became.